What drives a man already drowning in wealth to seek glory soaked in blood? For Marcus Licinius Crassus, known as the richest man in Rome, the answer was simple: power that could match his peers, Julius Caesar and Gnaeus Pompey Magnus. Crassus was a member of the First Triumvirate, yet unlike Caesar's military conquests in Gaul or Pompey's victories in the East, his legacy remained tied to money, not military greatness. That, in Rome, was a fatal imbalance. By 54 BCE, Crassus had decided to change that. At the age of 60, he set his sights on Parthia, Rome's powerful eastern rival. Located in modern-day Iran and Iraq, the Parthian Empire was a formidable adversary, feared for its cavalry and political cunning. Crassus believed conquest would be swift, riches would multiply, and Rome's eastern frontier would expand under his name. But the Senate never officially sanctioned his campaign. This was not a war of necessity, it was a war of vanity. Crassus marched eastward with approximately 7 legions, totaling around 40,000 infantry, along with several thousand cavalry and auxiliary troops. He crossed the Euphrates in 53 BCE without resistance. Some advised caution, including the Armenian king Artavasdes II, who urged Crassus to invade through Armenia, where mountainous terrain would negate the strength of the Parthian cavalry. Crassus, however, rejected the advice. He wanted a direct route, a swift victory, and most importantly, glory earned on Roman terms. Plutarch, the moralist historian of the 1st century CE, later wrote that Crassus was driven less by a thirst for glory than by an insatiable hunger for wealth, so much so that he believed no one should be called rich unless he could pay for an army. Crassus's army plunged deeper into Mesopotamia, underestimating the enemy and overestimating Roman invincibility. What followed would become one of the greatest humiliations in Rome's long military history, one from which Crassus would never return. The Battle of Carrhae, a crushing Roman defeat. The winds of the Mesopotamian plains carried with them no warnings, only dust, silence, and the fate of an empire's pride. Crassus and his legions marched eastward, confident in Roman arms, dismissive of any threat the Parthians could pose. After all, they were barbarians, or so many in Rome believed. But the Parthian Empire was no tribal backwater, it was a disciplined and formidable power. Its military might rested in the precision of horse archers and the thunderous charge of cataphracts, heavily armored cavalry who would soon carve their legacy into Roman memory. The two armies met near the small town of Carrhae, known today as Harran, in modern southeastern Turkey, around May of 53 BC. The Parthian forces, led by the general Surina, noted in Roman accounts as Surinas, numbered perhaps 10,000 to 12,000. They were vastly outnumbered by the Roman legions. Yet what they lacked in numbers, they compensated for in terrain mastery, tactical innovation, and the deadly mobility of cavalry archers. Crassus, ignoring the advice of his generals and local allies, arranged his army in a square formation on the open plain, a structure ill-suited to counter fast-moving cavalry. The Parthians began a relentless assault, not with direct confrontation, but with waves of arrows from their mounted archers. They used a technique now known as the Parthian shot, firing while retreating, never giving the Romans a stationary target to fight. The sun beat down as the hours passed. Roman shields bristled with arrows. The ground was littered with the wounded and dying. Every Roman advance was met by retreating archers, every pause was punished with renewed volleys. The Roman heavy infantry, the backbone of Crassus's army, was rendered impotent, marching against shadows and dying under the sky. One Roman officer, Publius Licinius Crassus, Crassus's own son, led a charge to break the Parthian lines. He and his men were surrounded. After a fierce but hopeless fight, Publius took his own life to avoid capture. His head was severed and paraded before the Roman lines, a horrifying signal of total collapse. Plutarch records that when Crassus saw his son's head, he neither wept nor reacted as men do in grief, but stood silent, clutching his sword, as if stunned by fortune's cruelty. The battle extended into a second day. Starved of water, morale, and leadership, the Romans faltered. Crassus attempted to negotiate a retreat, but his forces were scattered. Of the roughly 40,000 soldiers he had brought, over 20,000 were killed and 10,000 taken prisoner, one of the worst defeats in Roman history. The proud legions were annihilated not by a greater force, but by a better prepared one. The legacy of Carrhae was not only measured in blood and loss. It was the humiliation of a republic that believed itself invincible. And for Crassus, it was only the beginning of a darker chapter. His final misstep had yet to unfold at the negotiation table. Parthian punishment, a death sealed by gold. In the aftermath of the slaughter at Carrhae, what remained of Crassus's once mighty force was shattered, leaderless, exhausted, and gripped by despair. The Roman dream of Eastern conquest had not only failed, it had disintegrated into chaos. As night fell over the desolate plains, Crassus, once Rome's wealthiest and most powerful financier, became a desperate man surrounded by foreign sand and hostile arrows. The Parthian general Surina, known for both his military brilliance and theatrical cruelty, offered terms. He proposed a truce and safe passage if Crassus would come in person to negotiate. The suggestion divided the surviving Roman officers. Some believed it a trap. Others, consumed by fear and eager for any hope of salvation, urged Crassus to accept. The man who had once controlled entire districts of Rome through sheer wealth now had no clear path forward. Reluctantly, Crassus agreed. The meeting was set outside the town of Carrhae, near the Balissus River. Crassus arrived with a small group of officers. Surina appeared in full ceremonial display, adorned in royal silk, surrounded by an intimidating cavalry guard. Plutarch records that the Parthians feigned civility at first, offering food and drink, insisting the treaty be sealed by a traditional procession on horseback. But as the Romans mounted, tensions escalated. Accounts tell us a skirmish broke out. Some say it was a deliberate ploy, others claim it was a misunderstanding. Regardless, chaos ensued. Crassus was seized by Parthian troops. His guards were slaughtered. The richest man in Rome was now a prisoner. And what followed would become one of the most infamous punishments in ancient history. The Parthians, well aware of Crassus's obsession with wealth, devised a death that would transform his greed into poetic justice. In a grotesque act of mockery, Surina ordered molten gold to be poured into Crassus's mouth. His captors restrained him and forced open his. But then, in a symbolic act of cruelty, molten gold was poured in, turning his legendary greed into a fatal irony. Ancient sources describe the moment as both theatrical and brutal, carried out in silence as a grim message to Rome. It was not just an execution, it was a message. A statement to Rome that Parthia would not be bullied, that gold could not buy victory, and that arrogance had a price. His head and hands were later sent to the Parthian court, where they were used in theatrical performances, mocked before royal audiences as symbols of Rome's defeat. Some sources suggest Crassus's head was even delivered to the Armenian king Artavasdes II, used in a Greek tragedy performed for the Parthian king Oroda II, who was celebrating the marriage of his son. Though some Roman sources dispute whether molten gold was actually used or if the tale was embellished, the act remains deeply recorded in ancient literature. Even the Roman historian Cassius Dio, writing more cautiously, notes that Crassus was slain and his head sent to the king, with tales of his fate spread as a warning. The symbolic weight of Crassus's death endured far beyond the battlefield. He had gambled his legacy on conquest, but found only ruin. He chased glory and gold and was silenced by both. The Republic, shaken by his defeat, would never again look eastward with the same sense of invincibility. Rome's richest man died not in honor, but in humiliation, his final breath drowned not in blood, but in the molten echo of his own ambition. Crassus's death at Carrhae was more than the fall of a man, it was the collapse of Roman arrogance before a world it thought beneath it. His ambition reshaped the eastern frontier, provoked decades of Roman-Parthian rivalry, and showed that wealth and pride are no match for terrain, tactics, and fate. It reminds us that history punishes those who ignore its limits. Why do you think Rome underestimated the Parthians, and what did it cost them beyond lives? Comment below. As Cassius Dio wrote, and the Parthians, as some say, poured molten gold into his mouth in mockery, For though a man of vast wealth, he had set so great store by money as to pity those who could not support an enrolled legion from their own means, regarding them as poor men.